And we're back. You're listening to the Talkin' Boxing with Billy C show. And don't forget, follow us on Twitter. It's at Talkin' Boxing. That's TalkinBoxing. And it's about, well, it's time for the, let me just do this.
Blast from the past. We shine the spotlight again on fighters from years past.
Shadow, top-ranking heavyweight. Joe Louis is the leading contender.
Joe Frazier with a left hook. Good right hand thrown by Foreman that time. Look at that left hook.
Belt that goes to Ray Mancini.
It's Blast from the Past on Talkin' Boxing.
And this week's Blast from the Past is being sponsored by Sal's Neighborhood Pizzeria. If you're looking for the best pizza on the planet, look no further than Sal's Pizzeria to check it out, www.salsneighborhoodpizzeria.com, or give them a call, 912-268-2328. That's 912-268-2328. Make sure you tell them Billy C sent you. And if you mention Billy C, you're going to get a free dessert. I recommend the cannolis. This week's Blast from the Past features a guy that actually only got one world title shot, as far as I can see, and is a Boxing Hall of Famer. His name, Packy McFarland. And joining me right now to tell us all about Mr. McFarland is Mr. Alex Pierpaoli. What's up, brother?
Good evening, Billy C. How are you doing?
Oh, not too bad, not too bad. Getting ready for another cold blast. Imagine that. But, you got to do what you got to do, right?
That's right. It's the long-suffering winter.
I'll tell you what, it is a bad winter. And it was pretty bad last year, too. But it's just, we're off a month. Like years ago, it just seemed like, February started to warm up a little bit. Now February is like what January's used to be, So, I don't know. This is the world. She's a-changing, you know what I mean?
That's right. Yeah, it's more extreme weather, that's for sure. It's a warmer, wetter, weirder world.
Oh, but it's still our world, Alex.
It's still ours. It's our place. We call home.
It's
blue marble.
That's right. Well, Packy McFarland, another one of these characters from yesteryear. Tell us about this guy.
Yeah, this guy is really the epitome of the uncrowned champion. And, it really, if there had been another division, another weight class, I think that probably would have helped him considerably. Patrick McFarland, Packy McFarland was his nickname. He was the pride of the stockyards in Chicago, the Chicago Flash. He was born November 1st, 1888, and grew up in, we're talking the stockyards of Chicago. So this is where, animals were kept, livestock, and butchered. They lived, they were butchered, and then they were distributed. Chicago's still a big, thing for food and, hub for that. But where was the quote I just looked up? I just saw a thing talking about the smell. Oh, damn, I had a nice quote. I just must have closed the window. But yeah, they described it as, because it only was closed down about 40 years ago. Like in the 70s, they finally stopped one of the big stockyards, the Union stockyards. So I'm trying to imagine what we're talking about, what this place looked like and smelled like. This must have been a rough place to live. You're talking hard physical labor and the flesh trade. That's where it's the part of where we all get our food that nobody likes to think about. But that's where he grew up. He started boxing at 16, and he was definitely a stylist. This guy, we're talking a lightweight, 133 pounds. That's the problem of it, Bill, is that when he finally got close to the title, he was too heavy. So he would come in too heavy. And there's an interesting article I'll get to that it's really fascinating about conditioning, and it's because back then, boxing being so popular, they would just sometimes let a fighter, an entire article would just be a quote from another fighter, and it's Ad Walgast talking about the conditioning of Packy McFarland and some of his ideas about it. But that really was a problem for McFarland. Had there been a 140-pound division, he probably would have become a champion. But instead he had quite a bit of success and was very popular and made considerable money there fighting. At this time, this was before the fight we just talked about a couple of weeks ago. That was the Joe Gans and
Battling Nelson.
That was the crooked fight that that ended up getting boxing banned from Chicago. Before it, when boxing was doing really well.
Right. No, I'm sorry. I thought you meant it because every time you think of Joe Gans, you think of Battling Nelson. But this guy, you're right. If there was another division, but he did fight all of the guys. To me, I look at him as being more avoided from the other fighters than anything else because he was around in the era of the aforementioned Battling Nelson and Benny Yeager and Freddie Welsh. Jimmy Britt, a great fighter. As far as Freddie Welsh goes, we'll talk about that. Ascoli, might as well talk about it now. And he fought him several times. And the interesting thing about that is several of those fights ended in a draw, including the one time that this guy was technically given a shot at a world title in the record books. In 1910, he fought Freddie Welsh in the UK for the British version of the world lightweight title, which Freddie Welsh had at the time, and the fight ended as a 20-round draw, and he never got another shot at a title again, and that was in 1910, and he fought on for another 5 years. I find that fascinating that, you fight for a world title, it ends in a draw, extremely close fight, and then nobody wants to fight. Even in this era, no one wants to fight this guy for the remainder of his career.
Yeah, he definitely was somebody that, he was going to be a difficult guy because he could hit hard. He wasn't a monstrous puncher, and there's actually some really good video of him. I posted it on the Facebook site for the group for Talkin Boxing, and I will tweet it later. But there's some really good clips on YouTube of the third fight with Freddie Welsh, and then also his final fight of his career, which he still looks pretty good. And we'll get to that in a minute, but because that final fight is really impressive, and it sets a precedent for what we see 80 years later in Hagler-Leonard. Ad Walgast was another one of the guys around that time, and one of the things that he was saying was going into that, I think it was the third fight with Freddie Welsh. You're right, because that's where he got closest to anything that could be recognized as a world title, but it was the British world title, so it wasn't really the lightweight title. And but there was talk of him getting close to it and maybe fighting Battling Nelson, especially after he defeated Leech Cross in 1908. That was when they really thought he would be fighting Battling Nelson, but it just never seemed to come. It never came to be. They described his style actually as similar to Joe Gans, and if you watch him, he looks really quick. He kind of keeps his hands low, has a really nice uppercut, good, really well-balanced fighter. I think that's one of the things that's pretty impressive, Bill, about watching those old-timers is as much as the fights were longer, they didn't seem to waste movement, especially with their feet. There's a lot of movement these days. A 12-round fight is such a pressure cooker of activity compared to these old fights, and that was one of the things that Ad Walgast said going into these the fights with Freddie Welsh. He said, I like Packy McFarland to win if it's a short fight or if it's a really long fight. And he said, I know that sounds a little confusing, but what I mean is if it's a 20-rounder, I think Welsh gets him. In a 10-rounder, I think McFarland can, pressure him enough and stop him. And beat him. And I think in a 45-rounder, I think McFarland beats him. So it just shows you that, my God, look at the the idea of the kind of endurance contest that these guys were prepared to do, depending on what these fights were set at. But yeah, you're right. He had these 20-round no decisions that end up being mostly draws.
You mentioned that he was well-rounded, and you're right. When you watch a lot of old footage, you see these guys that they have a full arsenal. They know they're using every single punch. Sometimes today we watch fighters that specialize working in the body. Oh, he's got a great jab. Oh, he's got a right hand. Oh, he can throw a decent uppercut. But you never really see too many fighters that use it all. Even the two best fighters of today. I mean, Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao. I mean, you can honestly say that Floyd Mayweather doesn't use a full arsenal of boxing punches. He just doesn't. I mean, when was the last time you really saw him throw a good uppercut? I mean, he just doesn't. Packy McFarland used them all. But the other thing that I think about Packy McFarland that you just said, and I agree with you, he had footwork, really good footwork for a fighter. That footwork really wasn't as popular back then as it was. They were more, fighting in a phone booth type of fighters. That whole boxing and moving around and utilizing the ring and stuff wasn't really perfected. I mean, Benny Leonard did it, but the masses didn't. And Packy McFarland, obviously before Leonard, but he did. And you mentioned the Battle of Nelson fight. What I love about this era of boxing is that these guys, I mean, today, we talk about the fight that's not happening. So-and-so's team isn't talking, and this one and that one. Everything's political. Oh, it's got to go through my manager. It's got to go through my promoter. It's got to go through the network. These guys made these fights themselves, and Packy McFarland wanted to fight Battle of Nelson for his world title so bad that he practically fought him in the city, right in outside the Astoria Hotel. Did you catch that article?
No, I did not.
Yeah, he followed him all the way to the Astoria Hotel in New York City. And, was calling them out, basically calling them out. They almost went to blows. People had to break them up right out front, and which I thought was, just goes to show you how, and it wasn't like a Shannon Briggs move. I mean, this is a guy that would have fought him for nothing. I mean, it wasn't the money that he was looking for, although we'll get to that a little bit later. Packy McFarland was extremely successful money-wise, despite not winning a world title. But these guys, the pride of winning the title meant more to them than the dollars in the bank account.
Yes, definitely. This was certainly that era, and that was one of the things that I wonder if that because I didn't find too much about his disposition and stuff, and but there is a moment at the end of that Mike Gibbons fight, which is a really good recording, and that actually has. Mike Tyson's co-manager, Jimmy Jacobs, doing the narration. And at the end of the fight, you actually see McFarland threaten Gibbons, like he's going to keep fighting, and the ref has to actually come in, and McFarland's handlers come and pull him away. So I wonder what kind of personality he had, and so that's fascinating, the idea that he pulled a Clubber Lang there, following him around.
Yeah,
challenging him.
it was the pride, Alex. These guys, yeah. They could be the nicest guy until their pride. One thing I want to add, which I forgot for a second when you made the statement about the article you read, that in a short fight, he would lean towards Packy McFarland. In a 20-round fight, he would go the other way. But then if it was a 40-round fight, he would go back to McFarland. I think that shows you that second wind, and how these guys talk about conditioning. I'm just getting my second wind after the 20th round. What? What are you talking about after the 20th round? I mean, it's just amazing. And to suggest that fighters today, although I think, athlete-wise and nutritionally-wise and et cetera, they have to be better today. But I I just can't be convinced that they were better, that they are better today compared to these guys back in those days. I mean, it would just seem so rough, and conditioned well. I mean, to go 40 rounds. We're not talking about Tom Molyneux bare knuckle times where 40 rounds literally. I mean, one round could be 10 seconds if you go down. This was still in the 3-minute round era, so 40 rounds, similar to the Nelson Gans fight that took 3 hours in the hot sun. I mean, these were long ass fights.
Oh yeah, and if you watch those clips, I mean, these guys are fighting at quite a pace. I mean, it is one of those situations where, because of the age of the film and the transfer to video and all that, that the speed is probably not quite natural speed, but it's close enough that you could tell, what they're doing is certainly significant. It's a physical struggle, that's for sure. But yeah, one of the things that Walgas says is because this is a little bit of science, and again, whenever these guys talk about nutrition and stuff, what we know today, it's always fascinating. But this is Ad Walgas. McFarland must train long and earnestly to reduce. He gets heavy all over. That's the trouble with him. With me, it is a lot different. My weight comes on my waistline and nowhere else. One good run, and I can take off 4 pounds. I dry out well in the last day, too. I can lose 4 pounds more by refraining from liquids for 24 hours.
Yeah.
2 pounds will depart during a good night's sleep. So that tells you that maybe they were doing a similar sort of dehydration before we weigh in, like fighters of today.
Well, a couple of things. Number one, Ad Walgas was a big drinker, so he was probably losing weight because he wasn't drinking alcohol. The other thing is that not every fight was, and you know this from the Joe Gans stories and stuff, but not every fight was weighed where they could dry out. Sometimes they had ringside weigh-ins where they literally had to weigh in, before the fight. So that's an interesting statement from Ad Walgas. But I have, my one comment I was saying is the recovery, getting back to the 20 and 40 rounds. Think of this, and you're talking about the the early 1900s, right? Consider this. First of all, the water that they were drinking were in glass bottles, all right? So most of these big fights were outside because they housed bigger fans, and if they did have film, that's when they were filming them outside because they had no lights and all that stuff. So just like I don't mean to keep referring to Joe Gans in the Nelson fight, but that's in 100 degrees. The fight lasted for 3 hours. There's no ice, right? How refreshing could a glass bottle filled with water be in between rounds? I mean, these guys, it's really hard to even grasp how they could do it, to be honest with you, considering, what they have today. It's just, I don't think I can emphasize enough that the times in 100 years have changed. I mean, we're talking about this guy's last fight was 100 years ago. You just think about it. I mean, today, the containers that they keep water in can keep the coolness in that water. You're in air-conditioned facilities. I mean, it's just, everything's packed in ice. I mean, it's just, it's amazing. It's amazing. Let me read. I know we both respect Tracy Callis, right? His comment on Packy McFarland was, and this backs up everything that you said earlier about Packy McFarland. This is Tracy Callis, the author and boxing historian. He says, Packy McFarland was fast and clever with exceptional skills. He possessed and educated a left jab, stiff punches, fast feet, and a savvy of boxing that always kept him a step ahead of his opponents. Packy was one of the greatest fighters ever to come out of Chicago. So, I mean, he says it all, right?
Yeah, definitely. And just like what you were saying with the in terms of the water, another thing that was also the air quality was one of those issues in a lot of those places. They didn't call these things a lot of those fights as smokers for nothing. They often would be rooms filled with smoke where these guys were fighting. And in some of the videos that are available on the web, instead of round card girls, there's two men for each corner come up into the ring with large towels and will fan off the fighters during the 60-second rest. So there was a need to do that, to try to get these guys some air, because the whole place was so stuffy and hot. You're right. I mean, the conditions were just were not optimum, were not even compared to what they are today. I mean, it was, if you think about like a fight, maybe Hagler, or I saw something the other day when Frank Tate fought in Britain. There had been a tear gas canister that had gone off earlier in the evening at the venue. So every now and then you hear stories of that, but you're right. I mean, you got to think just in general. They certainly didn't have systems, a ventilation system like you do in a casino back then.
No, and consider this. This is another one of the fascinating things. This guy fought, over 100 fights, in his career. And he fought, his professional career started in 1904, went all the way to 1915. So you're looking at 11 years, right? He retired at 27 years old. I mean, he fought all those fights, and he walked away at 27. Which is amazing, I mean, never to return. Yes, he had that was kind of a return fight. His last fight against Mike Gibbons. He had actually retired 2 years earlier and came back that one time 2 years later. So I mean, this guy walked away from the sport at 27. He was extremely successful outside of the ring. In with his investments and all of this stuff. He ended up working with the commission, and something I found really interesting that I never knew was that he actually was helping Barney Ross when Barney Ross first turned professional back in the day, which I never knew. I didn't know that he had any connection with Barney Ross.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't heard that either.
I mean, one of the best boxing books I ever read was The Life of Barney Ross, and it never said that in there.
Oh, really? Huh. Yeah, it's interesting because I was surprised. I didn't see that he hasn't been the subject of a biography, just him. It does seem like there's a couple of... I did find a little bit about him in Alexander Johnston's book, 10 and Out, and he is in Burt Randolph Sugar's book. But that he did do very well. Like Famichan, who we did a couple of weeks ago. He retired pretty well intact and in good shape. And I alluded to the Gibbons fight. That one is even in a better quality video than the Freddie Welch one, and that one's worth seeing because I get the feeling that was definitely a super fight at the time because Gibbons was, the one of the top welterweights at that. I mean. See, that's the interesting thing. That fight itself was, he was a junior middle at the time. They met at middle, but it was, McFarland had returned to the ring, after an absence. So it was, a sort of comeback fight, a one-time, fight. He hadn't been in the ring since 1913, and here he is, September 11th, 1915, against Mike Gibbons, who's one of the best, welterweight, middleweights in the world. And that fight ended up what they called a magnificent draw. Some people argued that Packy McFarland might have won it, but you're right. Then afterwards, he did do very well in business. He was partners in a brewery, and he was a partner in a bank. And you know what they say, Billy C? It's you don't want to rob a bank. The best way to make money is to own a bank.
That's correct. Ask Google, because I think they're starting to get into banking now too. They're unbelievable. But interesting. Not to be morbid, but I know you always look into the obituaries and stuff like that. This guy died pretty young, 47 years old. Another crazy thing surrounding his life in terms of a crazy infection that ended up costing him his life. Do you know about that?
Yeah, it's a little. It sounds messy. it's pretty sad. He sort of self-destructed in a way. He was dead 21 years after he retired. He's dead at 47, and basically their heart issues. He got fat. Unlike Famichan, who I mentioned earlier, who they were similar in that they both retired with their faculties, with a lot of money, good prospects, but unfortunately for McFarland, maybe it's all that animal fat. He did, that stockyard living. He could have gone vegan after he retired. Maybe things would have been different.
They didn't have vegans back then.
There weren't too many vegans in the Chicago stockyard.
If you said
vegans were didn't live long.
No, if you said you were a vegan, they might have thought you were a witch and dunked you in the thing or something. But it was a disease called
intestinal influenza. So I get the feeling that's got to be like a stomach bug, a pretty horrible stomach bug, and then it eventually was accompanied by increasingly periodic attacks of coma.
Wow.
And then led to a streptococcus infection of the heart.
Right. That was the official cause of death. But what led up to it? What I didn't catch all the other stuff.
Yeah, he must have been hospitalized at first for intestinal influenza, which to me that's a stomach bug. This was from the September 23rd, 1936 Chicago, Chicago Daily Tribune. And he was a member of the State Boxing Commission in Joliet. He was survived by a widow, Margaret, a son, and 2 daughters. But intestinal influenza, I'd never heard of that. And then he had, was slipping into a coma. And then it eventually spread to his heart. So, it sounds like once you kind of, when you're sick all over like that and you get like that septic sort of condition, I don't know. Not too good.
I tell you something. Everybody always says how they wish they, it's not good time to be living and all this. I don't know. After learning about a lot of these old time fighters, when you die, when you go to the dentist and it's not even a safe thing to get a tooth pulled, and here a guy gets some type of an infection that ravages his body, eventually kills him in the heart. I mean, it doesn't seem like it was that great of a time, and in the 30s, think about what the Chicago boxing scene was like in the final days of Packy McFarland's life. I mean, in the mid-30s, look what was going on. There was a lot of up-and-coming guys that not so much the Chicago area with Joe Louis, but Joe Louis was fighting during that time, and all those greats during that era. I mean, must have been crazy,
Yeah, he did start working with one of those fighters that was up and coming. Maybe that was Barney Ross. I forget.
Well, Barney Ross in 1933 is when he started, and Barney Ross, that's when he started working with Barney Ross. I think before he got appointed. Actually, it was before that because he got appointed to the commission in 1933. So it was a young, up-and-coming Barney Ross, and then when he got appointed to the commission, he obviously couldn't do that anymore. But amazing. Barney Ross, as you know, was a two-time 2-divisional world champion. One of my favorite fighters. I have him up in the tops for the lightweight. But anyway, that's another blast.
I tell you, and I think that this has been cool that we've kind of done these guys around together, because I would kind of put him in terms of, I think he's a superior fighter just because he beat so many different guys who were top guys at the time. Even if maybe they were a little off in weight, they weren't all at like 135-pound bouts. I think you got to put him. I would put him similar to a Michael Nunn in that he had a unique style. And was definitely, like I said, better than a Michael Nunn in terms of, all-time greatness. But yeah, I did put him in with in the title bout championship boxing game. I put him in against, since there was no junior. I first put him against the number 1 Billy C boxing ranked lightweight in Terrence Crawford, and then I put him in against the junior lightweight number 1 ranked fighter at Danny Garcia, even though that division didn't exist. So first against Crawford, Packy won, a unanimous decision, really a real lopsided one. One score was 120 to 107. Two judges had it 119-108. I then had them fight 100 times, and Packy really mopped the floor with him. 92 wins, 6 wins for Crawford, 2 draws. Packy stopped him 78 times. Of Crawford's 6 wins, he did win them all by knockout. Against Danny Garcia, Garcia did a little better. Garcia, the first time they fought, Garcia won by a 5th-round DQ. This just seemed like an aberration. For some reason, they just, the ref called it after a low blow landed. So I don't know if the game sort of throws you little wrinkles like that every now and then, to seem realistic. But the judge, the ref, thought that low blow was so deliberate and so severe, he called a DQ right there. I then had them fight 100 times. Packy McFarland comes out on top, 89 wins, 6 defeats, 5 draws. He stopped Garcia 46 times. Of Garcia's 6 wins, same amount as Crawford, by the way, half of them, so 3 knockouts he scored over McFarland.
McFarland, technically, he never lost a fight.
He had one loss in his second year as a pro.
But that was a newspaper. But that was a newspaper decision.
Right.
So remember that technically. See, that's where it's confusing on BoxRec because
it is. And I actually saw, if you do a search for him on Google Books, there's an excerpt in a book there that says he actually lost 2 times in 1904. But I could not verify that. I could only find one. So you're right. There's, as we often see in guys from these ages, there's some discrepancies.
Yeah, because newspaper decisions, just for all the viewers and listeners out there, the way it's presented in BoxRec is they take the average of the different newspapers. They used to have, in this era, the decision, unless it was a knockout, nobody could win the fight, right? So they would render a newspaper decision. So depending upon where that newspaper was located, if it's the hometown guy, they usually went with that. So the BoxRec, I guess, found a way to take the average of these decisions and actually record it in BoxRec. But when you look at this guy's official record of fights that had a decision that did not go to a newspaper decision, he's 70 wins, 50 coming by knockout, no losses, and 5 draws. So those draws are the only thing that prevents him from being the world, the boxing record of the most wins. So I think that he's clearly a forgotten fighter that shouldn't be. Of the newspaper decisions, 36 wins, 1 loss, 1 draw, according to my records. Like I said, 70 wins, 50 by knockout, no losses, and 5 draws. One thing I want to mention, the names of the fighters that he beat in his career, the big name fighters that people will have heard of: Benny Yanger, Freddie Welsh, Jimmy Britt, arguably one of the greatest fighters of all time, Leech Cross, Cyclone, Johnny Thompson, Jack Goodman, Jack Britton, Tommy Kilbane, and Mike Gibbons, of course. So I mean, this guy was no slouch, and I find it the title bout game that you're talking about, they disqualified Packy McFarland because I didn't read anything about him being a dirty fighter.
No, me neither. And I think that is one of those things. I think when you look at how well he did against both guys, especially over the 100 bouts, I think it does show you that even the game looks at him in quite a high regard, and we all should. And I do think that if you do watch the clips of him, he's impressive. And I think and he's somebody I'd like to learn a little more about, because I'm curious why, if it was just that he was avoided. And also that question I brought up in the chat room, I don't see that he ever crossed the color line. And you wonder, and by that, that was the way the phrase was in those age, routine listeners know that, of course, but if you're new to the show, at the time, mixed race bouts were illegal, and, in most places, but some fighters did fight in mixed race bouts where one fighter was African American or black and the other was white, and I don't know if he ever did that. From what I see, all the links that you could go to on cyberboxing of significant opponents, they're all white guys. So I'd be curious if he ever did cross the color line. He never fought Joe Gans, of course, even though he was, as I said earlier, he was compared to him in terms of his style.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought of Packy McFarland as refusing to cross the color line, but like you said, it was illegal in some states. So,
maybe he didn't need to in a way, Bill, because if you think about it, he was so popular and he had a built-in audience and a region and stuff. So maybe he, didn't, and there was, because he never become a champion, he didn't have a chance to give a guy a title shot or not. So maybe that was something to do with it. But it's something I'll look into.
Well, by 1912, they claim that he made almost $250,000 in purse money, which is a lot of money back in those days. That's probably like $20 million by today's standards. So that's a heck of a lot of money, which we all know that all the fighters of that era were not making that kind of money. So the guy was definitely a top-notch fighter. He did get that one shot at the world title, like we mentioned, although it was a British version of the world title. Packy McFarland, like I said, 70-0 with 5 draws, 50 wins coming by knockout. He was only 5'7", 805 rounds with a 45% knockout ratio. This is all from a guy that actually retired when he was 26 years old. When he came back and fought Mike Gibbons, he was only 26. He was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1992. Packy McFarland, this week's Blast from the Past. And Alex, great job as usual with that one.